You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Xi Jinping welcomes Vladimir Putin to Beijing again. Is there much appetite for their alternative global order? The rivals for the presidency of the United States at least agree on a new debate format. And would K-pop encourage you to tidy up a beach? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Julie Norman and Chris Sabatini will discuss today's big stories, and our regular Thursday letter from is a letter from Copenhagen. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Centre on US Politics, and by Christopher Sabatini, senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Julie, first of all, helpfully for what we will shortly be discussing, you have just come back from China. How was it?
It was good. I was there on behalf of my fine university, UCL, and meeting with prospective students who still want to study in the UK, and also with some of our very fine alumni who are back there doing really good things. So it was actually really interesting to go and see what they're up to in Shanghai and Beijing, and just see what the country is like these days as well.
And Chris, by way of contrast, and what is at best of only tangential use to the rest of tonight's episode, you've been to Peru.
Yes, I was there recently for a project we're doing with actually the UK government on facilitating dialogues between indigenous communities in the interior of the country with the Peruvian government, which is constantly in turmoil. So the effort is trying to build some state capacity in the government to address these conflicts, but also to meet the guarantees that investors and mining companies are making when they invest to deliver social benefits to these communities, which often fall through the cracks. So, and that's been in many ways the genesis of the social conflict we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, or actually for almost a half century.
A quick follow-up on Peru, if I might, because we did do an entire episode of The Foreign Desk not long ago about just the astonishing run of gutter balls that Peru has had in terms of choosing a president. Is there any sense at all that things are calming down somewhat?
Not at all, no.
In
fact, there's another impeachment inquiry into the president. They have what I like to refer to as presidential inflation. They just go through each president, and it just means less and less. So it's in debate whether they'll make it to the next 2026 elections before they go through another president.
So we might have to do another episode. Well, we will begin tonight with the heartwarming spectacle of Chinese President Xi Jinping welcoming his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin to Beijing. It is their third meeting in a little over a year, a reflection on both Putin's dwindling invitations for obvious reasons and the importance Putin places on the relationship with China for equally obvious reasons. However, scholars of diplomatic nuance are now busy divining what lies in the gap between what Putin described as the unprecedented friendship between the two countries and what Xi called a relationship that he cherished and wanted to nurture. Julie, as our resident China expert, given that you've just been there and presumably know absolutely everything. Is there a difference in how both these men see the relationship?
Definitely a bit. I mean, Putin needs this relationship more than China does right now. And I think that you can read through the lines and see that a little bit in their statements. You know, Putin obviously wants to signal to Russia signaled to the world that China is very much in lockstep with him and lockstep with the war. And obviously China's been supporting Russia economically and whatnot, but I would say they've been very transactional about it, and they've also been keeping their options open elsewhere. And so this is, as they said, a relationship that's working for them right now, but they're not full in, I think, in the way that Putin would like them to be all the time.
Unsurprisingly, Chris, they did have a bit of a swing at the United States, which they characterised as, and I quote, destructive and hostile. Is there really anything, do you think, to this idea that they are trying to establish some sort of counterbalance to the United States, an alternative global order, if you will?
Yes, effectively, what they clearly want to do is try to sort of create a much more multipolar world. We see this in the BRICS alliance, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now add Saudi Arabia and Iran and Ethiopia. What they're trying to do is remake the global order in a way that does a number of things. One is they really want to remove the dominance of the dollar in the global economy. It's used often for sanctions, and it's used as a weapon. There's a great book called Paper Soldiers about this very topic, and they're really trying to remake that. The problem is they have different goals, whereas Russia really wants to sort of sow chaos, doesn't really have many cards that it can play. It's a weak economy. It is a pariah state. China is much more welcome in places like Africa and Latin America for its investment, its diplomatic initiatives, its ability to rebalance the global order, whereas Russia doesn't. And so at a certain point, I think their agendas will collide, but right now they're very much in favor of weakening the West, in particular the U.S. and Europe, and trying to remake a global order more in their image. In particular, trying to assert issues of national sovereignty, solidarity, and trying to remove issues of values, if you will, on democracy and human rights from the international global order.
Well, on that thought of values in particular, Julie, do we think that either of these countries, I mean, they do want to have global influence in that, they have economic interests, China in particular, around the world, but do either of them really want to exhibit global leadership in the way that, the United States talks about wanting to do that?
Yeah, I would say it's not something that we see a lot of. China has dabbled a little bit in that and starting to play a role in some negotiations between, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia last year, and even kind of dabbling in it a little bit early in the Ukraine war. But it's not really where their expertise is or where their main interest is. And I think Chris said it well. This is mostly economic interests and more of a sense of uniting not around a shared ideology as much as just opposition to the West, making the U.S. look bad, but not so much a guiding principle leadership on its own. And so I think that's one area where there's limitations, and it's something that just she has not been able to articulate in any kind of meaningful way or really shown the ambition in that kind of way.
Because, Chris, Xi did make some pro forma comments about wanting to see a two-state solution in the Middle East, but it's not really imaginable, or is it, that we would see Xi or a Chinese president trying to get properly into this in a way that we saw a US President Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or even Jared Kushner trying to get into this?
Well, in the same way, you wouldn't see Xi getting into it the way that, say, Brezhnev did in the Soviet Union. To go to Julie's point, there's no sort of coherent world vision that China is trying to shape. There's no sort of coherent sort of political agenda that it's trying to shape within these countries. It's simply trying to create a space that's much more amenable to its own ambitions, primarily economic, and to a certain extent in terms of securing some votes within the UN and other multilateral fora. But it really isn't all that interested in sort of recreating the world. So yes, they're willing to position themselves, they're willing to sort of grandstand in some ways to demonstrate their alliance with the global South. Which is curious because they're really not part of the global South, and they even claim themselves as an Arctic nation. So I don't know how you manage that, but
I mean, it's a big place.
It's a big place. It doesn't straddle both hemispheres, north and south. But that's clearly what they're trying to do, and part of this is simply, I would just say, sort of showmanship.
I mean, on the subject of showmanship, we have been discussing on the Daily earlier this week, Julie, that it is clearly beat up on China season in the US presidential election calendar. But there have been vague efforts made by the United States to try and prise China and Russia apart. Is there any imaginable stick or carrot that might encourage China to usher Vladimir Putin under the bus?
I would say that's probably not going to come from the U.S. during this election year. And I think we saw that this week with the release of the green sanctions, or the green tariffs with essentially 100% tariff.
Sanctions, tariffs, tomato.
But yeah, I mean, 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China, a real hike and other tariffs also. And so I think this is more what you'll see from the Biden administration. Obviously, there's been ongoing diplomacy. There's new relationships around drug trafficking, fentanyl, climate, these kinds of things. But there's just not really enough right now that provides the incentive to really put out an olive branch during this election year, especially.
Now, just finally on this, Chris, I did say at the top of the show that your recent peregrinations in Peru were of, at best, tangential use to the show. But is there excitement in Latin America, and this is where we bring your expertise in, at the thought of soonish access to all those Chinese electric vehicles they can't possibly sell in the United States?
Well, first of all, Andrew, thanks for finding the narrow bore of my expertise and bringing it in. Yes, we see now actually Brazil, Mexico are both sort of more open markets to Chinese electric vehicles. In fact, the U.S. is warning Mexico that it can't use the USMCA, the former NAFTA, as a backdoor way to bring in electric vehicles to threaten the U.S. market. But yes, it's going to try to offload a number of those and is clearly trying to lock in, even sort of the precursor metals and minerals, if you will, to the electric vehicles in places like Peru, Bolivia, so that it can produce those en masse. So yes, they're going to basically sell a lot of those EVs in the global south again.
Well, let's move along to Georgia, where protests are ongoing following the passing by Georgia's parliament of a self-evidently controversial new law which will compel foreign or foreign-sponsored NGOs and media operating in Georgia to formally register as foreign agents, an obvious echo of similar laws enacted in such havens of transparent democracy as Russia, Nicaragua, Venezuela and Uzbekistan. While Georgia's president, Salome Zurabishvili, has vowed to veto the law, she can and doubtless will be overridden by a further sitting of Parliament, which seems likely to be the cue for further protests. Chris, first of all, just as a general principle, is it clear what Georgia's government is trying to do here? Because on the one hand, this seems like a fairly straightforwardly pro-Russian move, but on the other, is there the argument that they're thinking that maybe if we do this much, we won't get ranks of Russian tanks thundering over our border and trying to conquer the entire country?
There's certainly an element of trying to avoid Russian aggression and trying to curry favor with Russia. But there's also domestic reasons for this. And we've seen this, Putin cites the issues of the color revolutions, the Orange Revolution. And, a lot of aspiring autocrats or even accomplished autocrats, if there's such a thing, they sort of pride themselves on trying to close down political and civic space. And for them, sort of outside influence or outside financing that sustains civil society organizations, independent press, that really sort of serve as to nettle the governments in these cases. And we've seen this in Nicaragua and Venezuela and other places, Belarus. They've sort of closed down that space. So they have their own domestic reasons for doing it, but it's very much out of the playbook of Vladimir Putin.
I do want to come back to that idea that there is a sort of authoritarian playbook, but also as a general principle, Julie, is there actually necessarily anything wrong with a given country choosing or attempting to regulate foreign influence on its media and on its civic society? Variations of laws such as this do exist in the United States and Australia, to name two.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why, as Chris said, this is kind of a backdoor tool that's used to enhance authoritarianism. Because on the surface, it makes sense. Like most states would plausibly want to have something like this. I think the U.S.'s law originated to try and regulate Nazi propaganda during World War II. So a lot of this comes from somewhat like even democratic principles in some places. But the problem is the abuse of laws like this when they are used to essentially exploit that legal premise to control civil society, to control media in the way that Chris said, and really just trying to limit their ability to do any kind of activism, human rights work, etc. So in principle, these laws make sense, but in practice, they're often abused.
So coming back to that idea of a playbook or an authoritarian playbook, Chris, is that what this is starting to look like? That this is a first step if you are a government for whatever reason attempting to thwart your country's progress westward?
Yes, precisely that. It is trying to reduce accountability, trying to reduce citizens' voice in that can criticize a government. To go to Julie's point, yes, there are laws, and you mentioned this too, in the U.S. and elsewhere, but those are trying to prevent propaganda from governments. In this case, you can imagine, for example, my organization, Chatham House, receives funding from outside sources. That would be shut down under the Georgia law, proposed Georgia law. So it would really shut down pluralism and debate in ways that are anathema to autocrats. And we're seeing this. And what they're doing are twofold. First of all, again, to go back to the point about Putin and Xi Jinping, this idea that they're pushing back on the West, pushing back on those norms. There's a collective effort among, if you will, sort of rogue regimes to try to recreate and really redefine the neoliberal sort of era of democracy promotion and human rights in their favor, but do it in a way that it's all about propaganda. It's shoving values from the West down our throats that we simply don't adhere to or believe in. And this can be actually, in some cases, we see this is in the case of, say, Uganda, for example, when it comes to LGBTQI rights, is they say this is against our values. So it's part of a larger, I hate to say this term, but cultural war that we're seeing globally that's trying to redefine their scope for autonomy and national sovereignty.
Well, Julie, on a related theme, i.e. that one, depending on how you look at it, of shoving things down people's throats, we have seen arriving in Tbilisi this week that posse of foreign ministers from the 3 Baltic states and from Iceland, which, if I've done the maths right, includes not fewer than 2 previous guests on Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk. Does that necessarily help, though? Like, doubtless it rallies the crowds who are protesting, and it rouses the pro-European tendencies in Georgia, but it's not exactly calming things down, is it?
And I would say that, right, it's in some ways it's brought attention to what's going on, and I think amplified it in a way.
Which was doubtless the idea.
Right, and so that was I do think that was obviously part of the intention. But right, these things obviously can have backlash also, and so when you have that, you have a mobilization around those outside actors coming in that can sometimes amplify this more. But I think overall, it's a sign of solidarity from the Baltic states. It's one that was someone expected that they would do that and to try and just to show their solidarity.
Just finally on this one, Chris, and it's not an original observation. The parallels between Georgia now and Ukraine circa 2014, what Ukrainians call the Revolution of Dignity, was prompted to a large extent by an attempt by Ukraine's then government to pull a similar sort of stunt. In that case, refusing to sign a law linking Ukraine closer to the EU. From this distance, does it look like the government in Tbilisi may have misjudged the public mood on this?
I think so. I think, again, there are reasons of self-protection against Russian aggression that are driving in part of this, but people, I think they're misjudging people's desire for freedom over larger geopolitics, and they're misjudging the fact, and this is true, I think, for Russia too, is the extent to which Georgian people want to belong to the West and not to the East. And this is really a battle between, ancient sort of, if you will, kingdoms of driven by Russia and driven by the West. And we're seeing this play out in real time. And I do think we're seeing that people simply, the Western option is far more attractive.
Well, to the United States, where it seems there will be presidential candidates debates this election season, though not as we may previously have known them. While President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have agreed to meet on June 27th and September 10th, the debates will not be convened by the Non-Partisan Commission on Presidential Debates. Instead, CNN will host round 1, ABC round 2, and there will not be live crowds of hooting riffraff. This development comes after Trump laid down the challenge.
We have an empty podium right here to my right. You know what that is? That's for Joe Biden. I'm trying to get him to debate. I'm calling on Crooked Joe to debate anytime, any place. We'll do it anywhere you want, Joe.
And Biden sounded quietly confident in his response.
Donald Trump lost 2 debates to me in 2020. And since then, he hadn't shown up for debate. Now he's acting like he wants to debate me again. Well, make my day, pal. I'll even do it twice. So let's pick the dates, Donald. I hear you're free on Wednesdays.
That last little jab, of course, a reference to the one day of the week Donald Trump is let out of court. Julie, June 27th, the next one. That's actually quite soon. Are you looking forward to this?
As my little niece says, cringe, I think is my response to hearing all this. But I would say we're all bracing for it, right? And I mean, Biden, I think, just knew he needed to do something. Like, he has just not been able to turn the polls around. And he's been getting money. He's been getting donors. Like, they keep thinking something's going to turn in his favor and it's not. So I think the Democrats are finally realizing they need to get ahead of this. They need to try and get Biden on stage, get these debates going, and do it under their terms, which for them against Trump means no live audience. So it's a bit of a gamble on their part, but I think it's what the campaign felt they needed to do to shake things up.
I do want to come back to the new format, but Chris, on that point that Julie raises, that Biden's camp have to do something, is it not the case, though, that he has more to lose here? Because if, as is far from unlikely, Donald Trump just loses his train of thought, talks obvious nonsense, rambles, has obvious brain fades, etc., that's kind of priced in even by his supporters at this point. Whereas if Biden goes on stage and forgets who or where he is, there might not be any coming back from that.
Well, I think what Biden wants to do is recapture the momentum he had after the State of the Union, where he came out, people even made jokes about it. He was just so vigorous. What happened? He wants to sort of capture that spotlight again, because if you notice, his poll numbers went up. It was a very good showing. And now, this is why he's moved it up earlier as well. Before heading into the primaries, he wants a stage in which he can show that he's full of vim and vigor, and he can give a speech that's full of excitement and can really, downplay all of the sort of all the clips that have been common fodder right now on conservative media, in particular, of him stumbling, reading from the teleprompter when he's told to pause, things like that. So now he really wants to sort of demonstrate it, and he needs that stage. So it's a risk, but it's one that I think is a very calculated one to show that this guy is vigorous and he can give a speech that's full of fire and brimstone when he needs to.
Julie, what do you think of this format, specifically the very, very early date of the first one, June 27th, by which, to be clear, neither will technically be the nominee of their party?
Yeah, I mean, that piece to me is a bit bold, to say the least, that they're doing it even before the conventions. And it kind of takes the wind, I think, out of the conventions a bit. And any Democrats who thought there might still be some opportunity to have replacement to Biden, that kind of takes that off the table. But as we talked about, I think they see that as strategic for the campaign currently. I think they're trying to push out any potential third-party challenges, say from RFK or others. But it will definitely be, it's different. It's a different move for sure to have this pre-convention. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how this goes this time around, having it in June.
Then, Chris, there has been, unsurprisingly, an amount of harumphing from the Commission on presidential debates, not least because they no longer appear to have a job. But is there necessarily anything wrong with the idea that you get, CNN or an ABC or one of the other networks to host the debate?
I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, the Commission debates has a whole formula and a format that they do. They've been doing this for decades now. But I think it's fair that it's a media, but I do think demonstrates, and including the little intro clip you play, that we're really in completely foreign territory. To have a septuagenarian and octogenarian behave like a bunch of, alpha males beating their chest, challenge each other to debate as if it's a World Wrestling Federation match. It's very outside the norm. And then to take it outside the debate, but I think that's, unfortunately, the political environment in the United States right now with these two candidates.
Trump, Julie, has said he would prefer an audience, unsurprisingly. Does the lack of one make it slightly more likely that we might have something resembling an intelligent conversation about actual policy?
Hope springs eternal. I'm not sure about that, but I will say that the live audience definitely is to Trump's favor here. I do think Democrats maybe are over-optimistic that, as soon as the U.S. public remembers who Trump is and sees what he says, suddenly they will, turn towards Biden. I don't think that's going to happen either. But as Chris said, Biden has overperformed, kind of exceeded expectations in some of these big moments, and I think they're banking on that this time around.
Well, to South Korea, the tourism authorities of which appear weirdly convinced that K-pop can be deployed to boost international arrivals to the country. Despite K-pop strongly resembling a genre actually designed to be played to encourage people to leave a given locale or vicinity, the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism are rolling out events which will offer the opportunity to meet K-pop stars and the opportunity to pick up rubbish, i.e. to both encounter noxious flotsam, which all decent citizens would prefer to see expunged from their neighbourhoods, and pick up rubbish. The K-popsters will lure youth to sessions of what is apparently known as plogging, which is, it says here, a combination of jogging and trash collection. Chris, are you enticed?
No. First of all, I'm a runner, so the idea of picking up trash as I run and listening to K-pop sounds like a circle of hell to me. But I will say, it is. I was in Seoul, South Korea in 2005, and then back in 2016, and the amount of enthusiasm. They have K-pop museums. It is everywhere. The frenzy, and it may even. Bring in outsiders. Chinese and Japanese were there in droves because of this whole phenomenon of K-pop. I mean, Gangnam Style may not float my boat, but I think for some people, it's just what gets them excited, and it's clearly manufactured and produced, overly produced, to incite people to be active. So it may work.
Julie, are you hearing the word plogging for the first time? I'm confessing it was news to me that this was a thing that people are doing.
I did. I had to look in my Urban Dictionary to see what was going on here. I mean, but I will say I think it's kind of fun. It's like I'm a runner too, so I'm like, oh, like running, like conservation, like all this stuff, and like some fun music. I don't know. I think it's a little crazy, but like, why not? You know?
Are you from now on, either of you, going to run with a big rubbish bag and one of those spikes that you pick up litter with?
Well, I would say if there's K-pop around, you might just convince me. What can I say?
I won't do that, but I'm going to drop the word plogging every chance I get,
yes.
Especially with my 19-year-old son. I want to appear hip.
I did want to ask you both, finally, if you can recall at all any sort of campaign that you think has been efficacious in encouraging people to either pick up their own or other people's garbage. The one that leaps to my mind, and I'm not sure it would work everywhere. It was a bold move, and it did work. When I lived in that part of Sydney many, many years ago, it elected a mayor whose name I recall was Ted Mack, who was an independent, and his brilliant idea, and it worked for cleaning up the streets, was literally remove all the rubbish bins. He just removed all the rubbish bins from the street with the implicit, actually it was a fairly explicit statement, take it home. And by and large, people did.
There was a successful story in Bogota where the then mayor basically hired a bunch of mimes to follow pedestrians around and mock them if they broke traffic rules and they dropped litter. Now, I hate mimes. I don't mean to offend any of your listeners.
Well, this is the thing. Every decent person hates
exactly.
I'm just wondering, like, how many of these mimes ended up just getting smacked in the mouth?
That's the question. They deserve danger pay. Exactly right, Andrew. But I mean, they would mock people and they'd tap them on the shoulder and show the trash to everyone, and it worked.
I mean, I generally take the view, and I speak as not a violent person, that mimes are cruising for a bruising even before they start pulling stunts like that. Julie?
I don't think I can top that one. That is absolutely amazing. But I did learn recently that the saying that I always just thought was a saying, don't mess with Texas, started as like a pickup litter thing back in like the 80s. And they had it like branded with like trash cans and stuff, like don't mess with Texas. And like, now we all just know don't mess with Texas. So maybe like don't mess with the mimes either. But I was just like, wow, that caught on.
I don't think don't mess with the mimes, Julie, is ever going to catch on.
There is another one leaps to mind, which may be urban legend. So I would implore listeners to check this one, not necessarily take it to the bank, but persistent story that at one point, I forget which state it was in, probably Florida. It sounds like something that would happen in Florida. A chapter of the Ku Klux Klan attempted to sponsor a stretch of highway, which was denied them. They then went to court to assert their right to... You're nodding, Chris. Is this true?
I've heard the story, yes.
Okay, that it's either a very persistent urban myth or it happened. That they won their case on freedom of speech grounds, that you zany people have, and therefore were able to put up signs saying this stretch of highway sponsored by the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. You're probably guessing the punchline. They had not really thought through the consequences, of course, as every decent person for miles and miles around drove to that stretch of highway to dump rubbish all over it, which these bozos then had to pick up. On that heartwarming, and God, I hope it's true, note, not one of those stories that I have advanced under the journalistic cover of Too Good to Check. Julie Norman and Chris Sabatini, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is time for our weekly letter series, this time from Copenhagen. Monocle's Michael Booth reports from a talk he gave in the Danish capital about happiness and the nation's angst at coming in second among the world's happiest nations repeatedly to Finland.
I gave a talk for the British and Australian embassies in Copenhagen the other day about the Danes, why they are the way they are, and in particular, why they're so happy, or at least claim to be. It was the day after the United Nations published their latest global happiness ranking, and Denmark was once again in second place, actually clawing its way closer to those first-ranked Finns. Permit me a brief sidebar here. The fact that the Finns, who are arguably the most dour people on earth after, Glaswegians, have been number one on the UN's happiest list for the past few years, seems to me to fatally undermine any shred of credibility in this self-reported survey. It's like Russians naming themselves the most peaceable people, or the Japanese self-identifying as the most gregarious or something. Anyway, I always try and keep my talks about my adopted compatriots, the Danes, positive and relatively upbeat. It's true, when I first moved here, I did moan about things like their public manners, their parochialism, the weather, taxes, the obvious stuff, but these days, and for many years now, I've been genuinely grateful to live in Denmark and think the Danes have every right to be proud of creating such a fantastically functioning, comparatively equal, and certainly stinkingly rich society. Good for them. I usually finish my talk with a quiz to find the most Danish person in the audience. Question 4, do you like candles at the breakfast table in July, for example? And then invite questions. As often happens, this time the question session ended up more as a kind of group therapy, with expat audience members unburdening all their frustrations and irritations at living among the Danes. On this occasion, though, one woman's long, heartfelt speech in particular stuck with me. After talking about how difficult she'd found it to make friends with Danes, and it's true, they are notoriously difficult, how she was shunned by the other mothers at the school gates and so on, she concluded by claiming that she'd been gaslit by them. They make me feel like this is how we do things in Denmark, and this is the best country in the world, the happiest people. There must be something wrong with you if you don't agree, she said. So she'd been gaslit by an entire nation. Was that even possible, I wondered afterwards as I drove home? I suspect that many people do feel a bit like that if they go to live in another country, especially if they marry into a local family with strong traditions and fixed ways of doing things. I felt a bit that way with my Danish wife's family at first, but I suspect there's maybe as much of a risk if you move to a different country and are isolated as a foreigner. So the more I thought about it, the more I've come to think that yes, being gaslit by an entire nation could definitely be a thing. And it isn't just the Danes who are guilty. After all, what was the whole British Empire if not a monstrous global gaslighting? No, we're not here for your resources. We've come to civilise you with cricket and trains and our laws. Aren't you grateful? No, well, pipe down anyway. You will be in the long run. And America's twin propaganda machines, Hollywood and Madison Avenue, what were they if not the most successful gaslighting operations in the history of mankind, persuading everyone from Chile to China, not to mention the Americans themselves and all those poor huddled masses who clawed their way to the shores of the US, that the American dream was within their grasp. I suppose it might have been once, but these days, not so much. Which actually brings me back to Denmark, because if any country can claim to offer its inhabitants, and even new arrivals, something resembling the American dream, that anyone, regardless of their background or class or who their parents are, or even, at a push perhaps, their race or religious persuasion, can self-actualise, can use the relatively flat playing field of free, reasonable quality education up to and beyond a degree in order to fulfil their potential, then it's Denmark. This is the real land of opportunity. But I didn't say that to the poor gaslit woman in the audience at my talk. I suspect it might have pushed her just over the edge. But I would encourage her to stick with Denmark at least a little bit longer. With Novo Nordisk's anti-obesity drugs making them even richer, there has to be a good chance that next year the Danes may well pip the Finns to #1 spot as the world's happiest people. For Monocle in Copenhagen, I'm Michael Booth.
Thank you, Michael, and there's always next year, Denmark. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julie Norman and Chris Sabatini. The show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.